Mass production by Mary, Paris, and Emily. Mass production is a system for manufacturing that allows for an abundance of product to be made at one time. It was introduced during the Industrial Revolution to appease the want for manufactured goods all over the world. Mass production allowed for production costs to be reduced by the use of specialized labor and the use of machines in the 18th century.
So, who created the assembly line? Well, contrary to common belief, Ransom Olds, not Henry Ford, was the first to use an assembly line as an aid for mass production. His company was Oldsmobile. Olds first used the assembly line to produce the Oldsmobile Curved Dash in 1901. Henry Ford later perfected the method in 1913 by installing conveyor belts to mass produce his Ford Model T. Some of the first products made on assembly line were cars. Because cars had a variety of parts and it was a timely process, a production assembly line sped up the process and allowed for companies to pay individual workers less money. One of the first products to be produced in bulk during the Industrial Revolution was flour. This innovation inspired and spread to other mills and breweries. Although the assembly line seemed like it had a solely positive impact, there were various downsides to the manufacturing process. The long hours and tedious, mindless jobs performed over and over became laborious and frustrating. If that wasn't already bad enough, their wages were often small and factory conditions proved to be dangerous. One of the first manufacturers to become fully automated was the pulley block. This was in the early 19th century. The assembly line was also facilitated by the development of interchangeable machine tools, such as the metal planer and screw cutting lathe. Last but not least was the large automated sewing machines that spun strings and cloths at faster rates than any human being could, allowing for the mass production of clothing.
Most families couldn't afford to only have one provider, so often the whole family would work. Mothers had to take infants to factories because they couldn't afford a wet nurse or a caretaker. Child labor surged. There was no injury compensation in factories, so in the case that someone was injured or killed, there would be no reimbursement to the family. Some women now had to work in factories, but most tried to find work as domestic servants or maids. Those who did factory work had to take their children with them or risk injury. Teenage girls made up the primary labor force in many mills. However, after the age of 16, they were paid about half what any male was paid despite age or experience. Many families were so desperate for money, they had to send their children to work. Some children started working as young as 5 or 6 years old. They would often work 10 to 15-hour days with only a few breaks. Children were hired because they were small and could go inside machines to fix them, and they had quick, nimble fingers. They made up a significant part of the workforce, and they worked for very low wages, and the risk of injury or death was very high. The first child labor laws weren't implemented until the mid-1800s. Abuse and mistreatment of children in factories was very common. Overseers would even torture children if they fell asleep on the job or weren't working fast enough. There were also frequent factory accidents. Children's fingers or limbs would be cut off if they weren't careful. If a child accidentally fell asleep, they could fall into their machine and be killed. In textile factories, if a girl's hair was caught in the machine, their whole scalp could be ripped off.
Mass production caused a long-term impact all over the world. It wiped out almost all small businesses as people flocked to the cities to get jobs. The amount of small independent businesses is still small today. Specifically, the mass production of the car left a huge impact. The world went from only the very wealthy people owning cars to almost everyone driving, and still today, it's rare to find an adult without a car. Because of the influence the Industrial Revolution had on the world, we have better working conditions in workplaces today. When people started to take notice of how workers were being treated, they started to try and make changes. Instead of being paid the minimum amount possible, workers now are required to give their employees at least the minimum wage. In factories with mass production, there was horrible ventilation and very small working environments. These conditions resulted in workplace fires killing many. Nowadays, fire safety laws require you to have fire alarms and escapes to ensure the evacuation of people inside. These changes wouldn't have happened without the use of mass production. Throughout the Industrial Revolution, child labor issues were a huge deal. Kids being underpaid, working with no safety training was very common. Even though child labor laws were created, it's still an issue today. Over 218 kids between the ages of 5 and 17 are still being paid badly and working in horrible conditions. This is still going on because employers still think that kids are much cheaper to employ. This is an idea that is still in play because of mass production in the Industrial Revolution.